Your podcast name is the first thing that your potential listeners will see, and it is important to make a great first impression with your podcast name. It can help you stand out in a crowded market and also help you attract your target audience. In today's video, we are going to look at 10 tips for picking the perfect podcast name for your show. Hello and welcome to TPU TV. This is Dilip. If you're new here and you don't know me, then I am an affiliate marketer, podcaster, and blogger. And I run the show, The Podcasting University, which is primarily a podcast about simple and implementable podcasting tips that can help you get started with your own podcast. And if you're new to podcasting and want to get started with your own podcast, then you might want to join my 10-day free e-course on how to start a podcast. This is available for free. Visit thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide and join the free course today itself. You'll be able to find a link to this course in this video somewhere, and you'll also be able to see that in the description box below. So go ahead, click the link and join the free 10-day course today. Now, on to today's episode. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at picking the perfect podcast name for your show. Understand that having a good podcast name is not only important from a first impression perspective, but it is also important in order for your target audience to relate to your podcast. Your podcast name is the first thing that they're going to see, and it is important that you make a good first impression if you want them to click through to your podcast and listen to it. So let us look at 10 tips that will help you pick the perfect podcast name for your show. Number 1, make it relevant. Now, it is important that your podcast name accurately reflects the content and theme of your show. It should be clear to your potential listeners what your podcast is all about just by looking at the name. So, for example, if you're running a recipe related podcast, then something like a kitchen table or cooking with John Smith is something that will be more relevant to your show and will let your podcast listeners or prospective listeners know what the podcast is all about. So pick a name that is relevant to your topic and that is relevant to the show that you're planning to launch. Number 2, consider your brand identity. Now, your podcast name should align with your brand identity. If it is a company brand or a personal brand, it has to align with your brand identity. And when you do that, you might want to think about the tone and the personality of your podcast and try to incorporate that into the name of your show. Now, good podcast name should also be something that is memorable and easy to remember, because if it is difficult, people will not be able to search that on podcast directories and they'll soon lose sight of your podcast. So pick something that is memorable and easy to remember. Number 3, engage your audience. Now, your podcast name should appeal to your target audience. Use a name that your potential listeners will find interesting and unique and attention grabbing. Now, you might want your podcast name to make your target audience curious and intrigued, and ultimately you might want them to click and listen to your podcast. So ensure that you're picking a podcast name that engages your audience. Number 4, optimize for SEO. Now, search engine optimization in podcasting is something that is debatable and a lot of people have varied opinions about it. But I firmly believe that you need to optimize your podcast for search engines, because search engines are something that will help you with discoverability and will help a lot of potential listeners find your podcast. So ensure that your podcast name is optimized for search engine. Use relevant keywords in your podcast, but don't use a lot, maybe 1 or 2 worded keywords in your podcast, in order to improve its chances of appearing in search engine results. Now, this will help you attract more audience and will help you grow your audience for your podcast. Number 5, be unique. Your podcast name has to be unique and it should stand out from the competition. So before you pick a podcast name, ensure that you're doing your research and making sure that there aren't any other podcasts with a similar name. Now, a unique name will help you build your brand identity and will help you set yourself apart from the rest of the podcasts and in the crowded podcast market. Number 6, avoid narrow or restrictive names. Now, you might want to avoid names that are too narrow or restrictive because they can limit the growth potential of your podcast. Now, for example, if you're wanting to start a podcast based on cricket and you name it the Royal Challengers Bangalore podcast, then you're limiting the purview of the podcast. Instead, if you pick a name something like the IPL Deep Dive podcast, since that name is slightly broader but still relates to your topic, it'll help you keep your purview, the purview of the podcast, a little broader and will help you with broadening your topics in the future. So ensure that you're not picking a name that is too narrow or restrictive. Number 7, test your name. So before you pick a name, ensure that you're testing the name. You can test it with a group of individuals. Maybe it is your friends, your social media circles, or your relatives. Send them the name of the podcast and ask what they are able to understand by looking at the name of the podcast. See if they are able to relate the name of the podcast to the topic that you're wanting to cover in the podcast. So do these kind of tests in order to check if that name is the right one for your show. And consider something that is memorable, that is relevant and appealing. So do some of these tests and pick one name that fits the genre, format, and the content that you're covering in your show. Number 8, check for domain availability and legal requirements. Now, before you finalize your podcast name, ensure that you're checking if there is a domain that is available for your show. Like, for example, in my case, the name of my show is the Podcasting University, and I have a domain that is thepodcastinguniversity.com. So you might want to check if there is a domain availability for the show, for the name that you're picking for your podcast, so that people are able to relate to these two. And I've always been talking about the importance of a website when it comes to podcasting. So ensure that you have a website for your podcast and that there is a domain that is available for the name of your show. You might also want to check if social media handles are available, because if all of that is the same, then it will be easier for people to relate to these names and to follow you on all of these social media channels. And another thing that you might want to keep in mind is don't pick names that have legal requirements, like, for example, trademark names or copyrighted names. Don't pick names that have these legal restrictions, because otherwise there will be a lot of unnecessary legal issues that you will get into. Number 9, keep it short and sweet. Now, this is pretty straightforward. Try to keep your podcast name short and easy to remember. Now, longer names can be difficult to remember and might not fit well in podcast directories where there is only a limited number of characters that show up, or even on social media platforms. So aim for a name that's not more than maybe 3 to 4 words long. It'll help you with search engine discoverability. It'll help you with people being able to remember the name of the podcast, and also in terms of appearing on podcasting directories. Number 10, consider future expansion. Think about the future of your podcast and whether the name you're going to pick will still be relevant if you decide to expand your content horizon maybe in about 3 years from now. So for example, if you pick a podcast about book reviews, then consider a name that could still work if you decide to branch out in the future and include author interviews or maybe literary news into your podcast. So you might want to look at all of these aspects and keep in mind that once you've crossed about 100 episodes, you're going to branch out into different topics, and even then the name of your podcast has to stay relevant. So ensure that you're picking a name that stays relevant even in that scenario. So there you have it. These are the top 10 tips for picking the perfect podcast name for your show. Now remember that your podcast name is an essential part of your show's identity, and it can impact its success as well. So take the time to evaluate and choose a name that accurately reflects your content, it aligns with your brand identity, and also engages your target audience. So keep some of these things in mind before you actually pick a podcast name for your show. And if you are able to pick the right and the perfect podcast name for your show, it will be easy for you to market your show, promote your show, and grow your audience. So ensure that you're spending some time before you pick the name for your podcast. That's all that I have for this video. I hope you enjoyed the content that I shared today. If you did, then do hit the thumbs up button below so that others are able to find this video. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comment section below. And if you want me to create videos on any specific topic, do let me know by commenting below and I'll create a video for you. That's all that I have for this video. Don't forget to join my free 10-day e-course. if you're planning to get started with your own podcast. Course is available at thepodcastinguniversity.com/free-guide. You'll be able to find a link in the description box below as well. And if you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell notification, because then you will stay updated with all of the latest videos that I release. That's all that I have for this video. I'll be back again the next week with another interesting discussion around podcasting. Until then, keep watching TPU TV. This is goodbye from Dilip.